Hi, I'm Ari, I'm the Oak Witch, and in today's video I'm going to be going over what is polytheism and different polytheistic paths. So although this is primarily a witchcraft channel, I thought it'd be nice to go over what is polytheism, do a sort of simple guide video on what it means to be a polytheist, how we can approach being a polytheist and different paths one may take as a polytheist. Witchcraft and polytheism has a rich interconnected history. Although you don't have to be a polytheist to be a witch, I find that the communities at least definitely overlap, so I thought it'd be nice to do this video. Plus I have had recommendations to do this, so that's what I'm going to be going over today. So what is a polytheist? A polytheist is simply just someone who believes in the existence of multiple gods. That is pretty much the basic understanding of what being a polytheist means. If you consider yourself a polytheist, you may end up jumping into labels such as a soft polytheist versus a hard polytheist. So a hard polytheist essentially believes that entities, deities, are all distinct, separate and individual to each other. These are entities that exist outside of the human mind or experience, and they're all unique to each other. Versus a soft polytheist who defines the gods in a less strict sense. So some gods can be different aspects of a singular entity, for example. So a soft polytheist may see certain gods from different cultures that all share the same associations of a particular natural phenomenon as the same god. So for example, one may see all the gods of thunder, so Zeus, Perun or Thor, as one entity, the god of thunder, but has manifested itself into different depictions cross-culturally. But a hard polytheist would not see this. A hard polytheist would see Zeus as a completely different entity to Thor. I really recommend watching Ocean Keltoy's video he did on this subject, where he goes through the different debates of hard polytheism versus soft polytheism. Very, very interesting, and yeah, check that out if you wanted more information about this idea. But yes, there are issues with either side, and this argument could go on and on and on, but ultimately how you perceive the gods, how you feel divinity makes sense to you is completely up to you, and there is no set rule or way to be when you're a polytheist. It's ultimately just down to how and what makes sense to you. Something which I thought I would discuss in this video is paganism versus polytheism, and are they the same? And I'm here to sort of offer my opinion, which is that no, they're not necessarily the same. I find more often than not that the term pagan is often used in substitution for polytheism, but I think there is some issues with conflating the two. If we look at the etymology of the word pagan, it was simply just used by early Christians at the end of the Roman Empire for those who didn't practice their religion. So pagan could have just meant anything that wasn't Christian. Of course, juxtaposing that to nowadays, where paganism, commonly referred to as neo-paganism, neo as a prefix referring to the fact that it is modern, this means something which is completely different now. We've reshaped what we mean when we say someone's a pagan, and people use terms such as earth-based or non-Abrahamic or polytheist to define what we mean when we say pagan, but I don't think all of these criteria are always correct and accurate. There are certainly many pagans who don't define themselves as earth-centered or worshipping the earth as a central part to their pagan path. So that is something that is worth considering, especially if we're looking at polytheists in general. Polytheists aren't necessarily earth-centered in their approach. Not necessarily. And you do find some pagans who fall into Abrahamic belief sets or sort of religious structures. And you find some pagans aren't necessarily polytheists. So there is this argument of semantics here, but I do think it's worth considering that paganism doesn't necessarily mean these distinct things as we tend to. So I think immediately conflating paganism with polytheism isn't always correct, especially when we're getting into paganism as quite a European word. How I guess define paganism is paganism as an umbrella term for a variety of traditions that are ancient European and pre-Christian in nature, and comparing that to a polytheist as described before as simply someone who believes in the existence of multiple gods or just more than one god. So before I get into the different polytheistic paths, I thought it'd be worth going over how we can approach polytheism and the most common ways people do. So I often find that polytheists tend to be reconstructionist or revivalist. So if one is reconstructionist in their polytheistic path, this refers to the concept of rediscovering these religious practices or deities from these ancient pre-Christian pagan or polytheistic religions through archaeology, through history, and through mythology. This method of practice in terms of your religious worship or polytheistic practice tends to rely on something which is academically sourced or historically verifiable. Revivalists, on the other hand, take a similar approach but perhaps have a little bit more leeway. So the severity in which it has to be historically verifiable is lessened, and they perhaps take that approach but recognize that it needs to fit within a modern lens and are not super strict of doing things exactly how these ancient peoples used to do. So it's about taking this information, using it as a guide to shape it into modern life and the changing times. Another approach one can have to polytheism is one which is syncretic. So this is the cross-examination approach and to combine multiple deities or religions. An example to give is that sort of Greco-Roman approach, so looking at the Greek deities and looking at the Roman deities, and scholars for ages have syncretized the two. So you can look at Artemis and Diana, Zeus and Jupiter, Poseidon and Neptune, Minerva and Athena. There are some lesser known Celtic paths which academics and scholars have syncretized these deities to more well-known Celtic deities. So an example to give, I guess, is Brigantia from the Brittonic Celtic polytheistic path. Brigantia has been syncretized with Brigid from Irish paganism, from Irish polytheistic practice, and especially if we're looking at history and the Roman occupation of Celtic Britain, and we're looking at the Romans who syncretized their gods onto the existing Celtic gods. A lot of syncretism has happened throughout history, from scholars to modern practitioners. It does happen, but it's just the idea of associating deities, maybe of similar associations or similar name etymologies, similar appearances. It has happened all across history, and sometimes it is and has been slightly damaging, and sometimes it's quite useful in providing valuable insights into how to understand these deities. And of course, if you take a soft polytheist approach, this is an approach you will likely take in your worship. And another way in which people do is being eclectic. So this is essentially mix and matching deities of different cultures into a unique path which is obviously individual to you. So modern eclectic polytheists may look at different pantheons and sort of pick and choose gods from each of these pantheons. I don't love using the term pantheons because the modern pantheons we have, like as we know them today, didn't really exist in these ancient religions, not in the same way at least. Gods tended to be local to specific areas. But yeah, eclecticism is essentially borrowing ideas of different religious structures, practices or deities, and putting them into something which is obviously your own unique path. I think obviously something to highlight is the danger of eclecticism, where you are just taking sort of what you want from different cultural sacred practices without actually acknowledging the cultural context and the importance of the tradition in which they were worshipped in. There is a danger of just sort of taking like a name of a deity, for example taking Artemis, and not actually researching and considering how Artemis is worshipped from a Hellenic perspective. So that's something to consider. There isn't anything inherently wrong with eclecticism, but I do think that it is important to do your research, to study the culture in which these deities were actually worshipped and where they originated, to listen to practitioners who are from that culture and actually have experience worshipping that deity. Researching the history of that region. There's many things which you can do to be respectful in your approach to the gods, and yes, it's all very important, especially if we're considering how that deity would like to be worshipped. So it's all about that respect. These different approaches to polytheism, again, there is not one thing which is the correct way, there is not one thing which is the wrong way. The advice I would give is just to be respectful and to be considerate of your actions and your approach. So now I'm going to go over some polytheistic paths. Now, I will not be able to go through every single polytheistic path there is in the world. I just would not be able to do that. I'd be here for ages. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go over a lot of the main ones which I see a lot online in communities, so I thought I'd go over those. So the first one I want to talk about is heathenry or Norse paganism, and this is a polytheistic path which focuses on the deities of the pre-Christian Norse and Germanic people. In how one approaches heathenry, as with most of these traditions, you can either be geographically specific in your worship to certain gods or have a more pan-Germanic approach. So, for example, you can look at Anglo-Saxon heathenry, which is specifically the Anglo-Saxon gods in England, but what I find the majority of modern heathens do is reconstruct their beliefs through many different archaeological sources that span across pre-Christian Northern Europe. So it's looking at the Norse and Germanic peoples as a whole and the gods that they worshipped to form this kind of Norse pantheon. So some of the Norse deities can include Odin, Frigga, Thor, Freya, Loki, Heimdall, etc. In my 12-ish years of being a pagan, I have actually identified as a heathen for a long time. I no longer identify as heathen, I'm no longer on the Norse path, and that changed very recently, which I'll get to in a minute. But I was heathen for a large part of my pagan life, and I worked closely with Skadi as a goddess, and I also did closely worship Odin and Frigga. But I find heathenry is a beautiful path, and it has a strong modern religious structure comparative to other polytheistic paths, I find. There's also rich mythology to study in order to get a better understanding of these gods. So I do recommend looking at the Prose and Poetic Edda. These are the sort of primary sources. There are some others, but I'll have some links below in the video description for resources for these different paths, so have a look in there if you are interested. The book I do recommend is A Practical Heathen's Guide to Asatru by Patricia M. Lafayette. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce, but that's what it looks like there. And I read this a while ago, but what I remember it being a really nice, just basic guide to being a Norse pagan. There's some really nice exercises in here which I remember enjoying. Now the next path I'm going to talk about is Celtic polytheism. Now this is a very, very broad term to describe polytheistic paths of pre-Christian deities from the Iron Age people of Western Europe. So basically Celtic polytheism is not a singular thing. When you look at the Celtic people, in which they didn't call themselves Celtic, and there were hundreds of tribes across, Iron Age Western Europe, and you'll find that the gods greatly differed depending on the region. So you can be looking at the sort of Gaelic Celtic, so this could be like Scottish and Irish, or we can look at Brythonic, which is Brittonic or Welsh. You can look at continental Europe, so you could be looking at the Gaulish Celts. And I'm going to sort of briefly go over some of the main Celtic parts. I won't be able to go through all of them because there were loads and loads of different tribes of people, so I'll just go over sort of the main ones people recognise. So Irish polytheism is the idea of worshipping the numerous gods from pre-Christian Ireland. We have the Dagda, we have Danu, we have the Morrigan, Brigid, we have Lu. There's many deities, but maybe those are some recognisable ones. I don't have many personal recommendations for resources for Irish polytheism, but what I do have is this really amazing, comprehensive Irish document, this resource document that my friend shared with me in my Discord server, and I will share it below in the video description. I really recommend looking through that. There are some great resources there, how to respectfully approach Irish polytheism as a path, from beginner friendly resources to maybe more advanced reading material. Really recommend it. So go look through that document if this really interests you. But yeah, another popular one is Welsh polytheism. So yeah, this is a polytheistic path for the deities of pre-Christian Wales. So some examples of deities can include Ariandrod, Mabon, Bran, Rhiannon, Arawn, and many others which I will probably butcher the pronunciation of. The primary resource for Welsh mythology is the Mabinogi, and again this is free online legally to read, and I will probably link it in the bio for you to go through. And another resource I wanted to shout out is Mara Starling. She is a Welsh pagan and folk magic practitioner. She has a great YouTube channel and she's actually releasing a book coming out this year. I just want to shout her out because I love her content. So she educates all things about Welsh spirituality, so I do recommend that if you are interested in Welsh Celtic polytheism. There is Gaulish polytheism, which essentially refers to the polytheistic path of these sort of pre-Christian deities from Gaul. The Celtic tribes of Gaul inhabited many places, but I guess the main ones you can look at is from Western Europe, so France, Belgium, Switzerland, southern Germany, northern Spain and northern Italy, and some Austria and the Czech Republic. There's many sort of, if I can find a map, maybe I'll put one here. But we're looking at more continental Europe for the Gauls, though they did travel into Britain. So the countries I just outlined describes a whole widespread area of Western Europe. So obviously you'll find that a lot of these Gaulish deities were really local to specific areas, but some of the main ones which were quite widespread and people sort of know about are Taranis, Kununos, which is a really popular one thanks to Wicca, Epona, Artionis, Belenos, and yeah, so with Gaulish polytheism, I'll try to have some links down below, but with Gaulish polytheism there isn't really a centralized mythology, and a lot of the modern worship is through constructing just modern practices from archaeological records, so it tends to be a lot more reconstructionist or revivalist. And that leads me to Brittonic polytheism, which is the last Celtic polytheism path I'll talk about, and it is my own pagan path currently. Now, this refers to the worship of gods from pre-Christian Britain, or more specifically England. It's quite similar to Gaulish polytheism probably. There are basically no modern resources for Brittonic polytheism. It's very much reconstructionist. It's a lot of study, a lot of research to build this sort of modern religion out of these sort of forgotten deities. So it's reading through a lot of history and archaeology, which I love reading obviously, but it's a lot of work as well. So some of the deities which may get brought up with Brittonic polytheism are Andraste, we have Nodens, Brigantia, Coventina, Sulis, and we also have this presence of Gaulish deities in Britain, in England, where I guess just the migration of these tribes into England. So we do have strong evidence of worship for Taranis and Epona, for example, but those are specifically Gaulish deities. So when we're getting into this modern sort of Brittonic polytheist path, there is this bit of syncretism and I guess eclecticism when we're looking at the deities that just were worshipped in Britain. So they may not have originated in Britain or Britannia, but they had strong evidence of worship there. So many modern Brittonic polytheists do tend to worship them. There is no mythology again, there's no Brittonic mythology. A lot of modern Brittonic polytheists do look at the Mabinogi as a resource for their own sort of deities, I guess taking a more syncretic approach, And if we're looking at just general Brythonic polytheism, which I find is a bit of an umbrella term, especially when we're looking at like, you know, Welsh and Brittonic. So there is this distinction, but a Brythonic polytheist might also worship the Welsh deities, in which the Mabinogi would be quite a useful resource. There is some bleeding, I'd say. I don't think it's quite as clear-cut, as these deities weren't always put into the specific labels that we kind of do now. You know, there are hundreds of Celtic deities, and as we can see, their worship was quite widespread and really localized in like similar and different contexts. So it's very hard to sort of get into this idea of what deities fit into which sort of category. But yeah, that is a whole sort of thing. That's a whole other video to probably go down. But yeah, so I just want to say that some of the deities can bleed over into different sort of polytheistic paths, but generally we have these sort of structures. So let's move on from Celtic and let's go on to Hellenic or Greek paganism. So this is a polytheistic path which follows the deities from ancient Greece. I would say similar to heathenry, Greek paganism, or you know, Hellenism, has quite a strong religious, like modern religion, and it's quite a popular one in terms of mythology. Classical mythology, the Greek mythology, is something which is actually quite mainstream, I'd say. You see it a lot in movies, in books, in video games. You know, a lot of people know about Greek mythology, and for example the tale of Hades and Persephone. Again, like most polytheistic paths, Greek paganism, Hellenism relies on, you know, reconstruction from archaeological records, from mythology, through those academic sources to get a better understanding of how to approach deities in the modern day. And some examples of deities can include, you know, Zeus, Artemis, Hera, Hecate, Aphrodite. So many names which I'm sure will be very familiar to you. It's been largely reconstructed by the works of, you know, Ovid, Homer, Hesiod, and many more authors, and a really great website that is so valuable for Hellenic and Greek pagan practice is theoi.com. This is a really, really valuable resource, very well researched, and it goes over just anything you can really think of. I'm not a Greek pagan. I have worked with Hecate in the past, so I have done that sort of background research myself into Hellenism and Greek paganism, so I did like to use that resource a lot. That's very good. And some other resources I'd like to shout out are Thelda Blythe and Aliakai's channels. They're both really great resources for Greek paganism, Hellenism, and I love their content and really recommend you check them out if you're interested in this path. I'll briefly talk about Roman polytheism as a polytheistic path for the deities of ancient Rome. Again, a lot of reconstructionism and revivalism for this path, and as I mentioned when I was talking about syncretism, a lot of people do tend to take that syncretic approach with Greek paganism, with Roman paganism. It's not a path I know much about, so I won't go too much into it, but some deities which may be very familiar to you are, you know, Jupiter, Bacchus, Juno, Diana, Minerva, Mars, and etc. The next one I'll talk about is Kemetism or Egyptian polytheism, and again this is just worshipping the deities of ancient Egypt. Egyptian polytheism has really rich mythology as well, and some deities are probably quite popular and quite familiar to you. So you have Ra, you have Isis, Osiris, Anubis, Set, Bastet, very many. We have Rodnothry, which is Slavic polytheism, and this is a path that's centered around the worship of deities of pre-Christian Slavic Europe. These deities can include Perun, Chernobog, Belobog, Veles. I don't really know much about Slavic polytheism, I'll admit. It's not a path I'm too knowledgeable on. I've read that it can relate to Baltic mythology, and sometimes there is syncretism there with those deities. But yeah, so the next two I want to talk about have more sort of substantial modern religious structure. So it's Druidry and Wicca. So Druidry does relate closely to Celtic polytheism, obviously, but I wanted to have it as a separate thing because I do think it is distinct. So the Druids in an ancient context were peoples of Celtic society that acted as judges, teachers, or priests. And when you compare that to modern Druidry, it does mean a different thing. Modern Druids are not like a direct descent of ancient druids, that's not the case, but instead it is inspired by them. So it is a spiritual religious movement. I would say it's less reconstructionist in its approach. It is more pan-Celtic, I tend to find, and it has this emphasis on connecting or reconnecting back to nature and living harmoniously in this natural world. There are specific druidic organisations one can join. For example, the Obod is one of them, but you can be a solitary druid to my understanding. And the last one I want to talk about is Wicca, which is probably very familiar to you. And Wicca is by definition a polytheistic path, but typically venerates a god and a goddess. Although there is this overarching sense of duality in approaching the divine, so this god, goddess, lord or lady, it's still polytheist in the sense that the deities which you venerate as a Wiccan can differ, and you can worship more than one god and recognize more than one god. So I often find that the nature of this dualistic view of the god and the goddess is taking a soft polytheist approach. So typically it is seen that all goddesses are an aspect of the goddess and all gods are an aspect of the god. British traditional Wicca initiatory covens are emphasised as orthopraxic, so what matters most is the practice of their ritual and their sort of coven meetings, but the names of the deities tend to be hidden to the coven, but the beliefs that you hold can vary to the individual. This is my understanding from my own sort of mother being a HBS. So to my understanding, the beliefs you hold are still individual to you as a pagan, as a practitioner, and what is more emphasised as a part of an initiatory coven is the practice of ritual, for example. So whatever your theological beliefs are is something that's still individual to you and not something you have to believe as a group. It's difficult because initiatory covens are autonomous. What one coven does will be different to what another coven does. They are, completely autonomous. So I can't really speak for all initiatory groups, and I'm not an initiate myself. But what I will say is that the names of the deities tend to be hidden to covens only. They have this oath-bound information. And as a solitary Wiccan, what you believe, the deities that you worship are obviously unique to you, and that is something which you can sort of decide for yourself. So yes, before I close the video, I would like to discuss an issue which is present in many polytheistic and pagan paths, and that is the issue of discrimination. In particular, there are certain polytheistic groups and pagan groups that like to state that you have to be a certain ethnicity, nationality or skin colour to practice that polytheistic path. And this is not true. On the whole, these polytheistic paths do not state such a thing. They are not exclusive in who gets to practice and worship these deities. This is just not the case, and people who do spout this hateful and discriminatory rhetoric, we should stand against it, we should identify it, as it is a concern. It is an issue in our communities, in the pagan community as a whole and in specific polytheist communities. It's unfortunate, but it's worth identifying, it's worth spreading that awareness that anyone can practice and worship these gods, so long as you are, like I've said before, respectful in your approach. You do the research, you do the study, and you listen to the voices from people of these cultures, especially when we're getting into things like cultural appropriation. It's worth taking the time to listen, to study, and consider these important cultural nuances when you're approaching these deities, and that is definitely something to consider. But to go as far as to say that only, for example, white people can worship the Norse gods, this is not true. This is white supremacy, and this is something we need to stand against. Thank you so much for watching. If you got to the end of this video, thank you, I very much appreciate it. If you liked this video, it'd mean a lot if you gave it a thumbs up. And if you have any questions or anything, feel free to leave in the comments. I'd love to talk about this more. Really sorry if I missed out some really obvious polytheist path. I just wanted to keep it brief and short whilst explaining what I feel like I can sort of talk about with some level of confidence. I didn't want to go into anything which I was too unsure of and do it a disrespect, so yeah. In the description I'll have the sort of references I used for this video and you can sort of check them out, and I'll have resources for different paths. I'll have it all in the description of the video, so do check that out if you're interested. And yeah, thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!